last chapter of the book of 2 Samuel starts off with a text issue right in the first verse. We'll talk more about that in this episode. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thank you for joining me as we together study 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 to 9, and learn about a census taking that should not have happened. We're going to have to do this in at least 2 parts, if not 3, still to be determined. In verse 1, we are told that God's anger burned against Israel again. We're also told in the second part of the verse, and I quote the New American Standard Bible, quote, "And it incited David against them to say, 'Go, number Israel and Judah,'" end of quote. Now, right off the bat, we have 2 issues. First, which came first, God's anger or David's desire to number the people for which God got angry? And second, who or what exactly incited David to take the census? It's not that simple. Let's deal with the first issue of which came first, God's anger or David's call for a census. Clearly, if we stay with the text as presented, we will have to say God's anger came first. If we take that position, we can no longer claim with any degree of confidence that God was angry because David was going to take a census. Although some would argue that God would easily get angry for something that he knew David would be doing down the road. That's possible. However, overall, and not considering that last possibility, all the commentators seem to believe that God's anger had to do with the census for various reasons, which we will touch on later, if not today, at the next episode. And thus the 2 phrases in verse 1 are given in reverse order to their chronological occurrence. And that is quite possible, as the author may have thought of them as interrelated, but got them in the wrong order. Now let's turn to the second issue, who or what exactly incited David to take the census? If you look at other versions, here's what we get. The King James Version says, quote, "And he moved David against them." The New Living Translation says, "He caused David to harm them," right after referring to the Lord. And many others follow this train of thought, simply implying God, who is the subject of the first phrase. And the New King James Version even drives this home by putting a capital on the word he. It's not until we get to Young's literal translation that we read, quote, "And an adversary moveth David about them, saying, 'Go, number Israel and Judah,'" end of quote. When we go to the Greek translators of the Hebrew, at this point in the scripture, we end up with, "And the wrath of the Lord was kindled in Israel, and he smote David among them, saying, 'Go number Israel and Judah.'" Well, everyone can't be right. So, who did what to whom? Was it God? Was it the Spirit of the Lord? Or was it someone or something else? To get one answer, we go to the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles, where we read, "Then Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel." I believe that's 1 Chronicles 21:1. I think that takes care of our translation difficulty in our current passage. But we point out how important it is to dig carefully into Scripture, as we've been doing in Digging for Scriptural Gems, and trying to resolve our dilemmas with the help of other passages, something the Bible is very good at. We also need to realize that the translators are not immune from making translating errors, as we have seen time and time again. Excuse me, but let's move on. So this was very much a human thing. God was angry. We don't know if David knew it or not, but chances are he did. And rather than go to God to ask for advice on what to do, he allows his own emotions to guide his actions, regardless of where the shove or urge came from. Big mistake for David, and big mistake for us when we do that kind of thing. When our emotions cause us to take action that is contrary to what God would have us do, we can be pretty sure, that is, that the urge or the stirring to do so is coming from the enemy. This is very important these days, as Christians are becoming more vocal about certain behaviors in our society. We've had enough, and one example is transgenderism. And many are calling that a mental illness brought on by the enemy, the devil himself. Now, I don't expect non-believers to understand or to accept that, but for me personally, I buy it, as I believe Satan is the author of all evil, loves death, hates Christians, and wants to be worshipped. And he is certainly active today as he senses his final demise ahead. If we deny his involvement in the world today, we're certainly not familiar with our Bibles, to say the least. Anyway, David gives the order to Joab to go about and number the Israelites and register the people. And he gives his reason for that. Quote, that I may know the number, end of quote. Now we note near the end of verse 2, but only from the New English Translation and the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, not most other versions, that he specifically said to Joab, muster the army so I may know the number. And that makes sense since Joab only reported on the number of warriors in Israel, not all the people. But why was God angry? Well, for that we turn to gotquestions.org, which gives this explanation. Quote, as to why God was angry at David in those times, a man only had the right to count or number what belonged to him. Israel did not belong to David. Israel belonged, you will remember, to God. In Exodus chapter 30, verse 12, God told Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come upon them when you number them. Did you hear that? Each one must pay the Lord a ransom, and then no plague will come upon them. It was up to God to command a census take place. And if David counted, he should only have done it at God's command, receiving a ransom to atone for the counting. This is why God was angry again with Israel, and is also why David was conscience-stricken after he counted Israel. End of quote. Chuck Smith offers this explanation. On the basis of the fact that God had declared that he was going to multiply Abraham's seed so that it would be as the sands of the seas and the stars of the heavens, innumerable. For David then to seek to number the people or to count the people, to take the census, was actually in a defiance, or in defiance in a way, against the promise of God, which God had declared that he was going to multiply them until they were innumerable. End of quote. In verse 3, we see Joab objecting to what David wanted to do. While he had his own problems with how he handled people, Joab had his obedience to God down pat. And his commanders joined him, but David's wish prevailed. In fact, if you look at Joab's words in verse 3 very carefully, read between the lines, you'll see that Joab detected some pride in David's wish as he wondered why this was necessary. So what do we learn from this passage? David, in his later years, near the end of his reign, slides back into wanting some credit for his achievements, rather than giving all the credit to God. That is no way to finish well. May that never be our fate, no matter what your ministry is, what your service is. Next time, we're going to look at this passage again and see what the outcome, and I don't just mean the statistics of the census, was for Israel. In the meantime, I encourage you to keep on studying the Bible. Write to us with your thoughts, your questions, your comments. And we'd really appreciate it if you liked our YouTube video and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Digging for Scriptural Gems.